So today I'm talking about a book that makes its rounds both in psychology and politics. And where are we? Ordinary Men, Reserve Police Battalion 101 and the Final Solution in Poland by Christopher R. Browning. And this is the revised edition. Explain the revision in a bit. So, what makes this interesting is this particular reserve battalion was probably one of the best documented instances of people in Germany involved with the final solution. Now, the because of the nature of, because I mean, you couldn't imprison and hang every single person who had any kind of involvement in the final solution. So they ended up creating certain classes of people who were kind of considered not really in the position to be fully responsible for all the stuff they did. And so these guys, although they were heavily involved, uh, didn't really get the judicial action against them. And so people recognized that this was kind of a special group. And what ended up happening is actually all the survivors uh, got interviewed essentially for historical purposes primarily, and they re-interviewed them at intervals, I believe 5 and 10 year intervals afterwards, just get a feel for like if new information would come about, if their stories would change, other things like that, and it ends up being the data in that is absolutely invaluable. Interestingly enough, several different authors have gone over this data and have come up with completely different conclusions. We'll talk a little bit about those towards the end, but I want to talk primarily about what the author came up with in terms of Mr. Browning. So, um, so we have to understand a little bit about the whole police battalion thing. Okay, so uh, when Germany was under the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty, they had limits on how big their army could be. In order to get around this, in order to train up enough people to deal with future threats, they dramatically expanded the size of their police forces. And their police forces were essentially paramilitary units at that point that were actually built to be integrated into the structure of the military. Now, obviously, you needed some people to be staying behind for stuff. And so these reserve uh, military police units were formed, and uh, I don't know what they had envisioned with them prior to war breaking out, but once war broke out, they decided to use these guys primarily to fulfill the job of policing occupied territories, so that they would maintain law and order there until they could figure out a long-term solution for the area, which would probably involve building up local units that were uh, loyal or at least willing to put up with the regime. Now, the thing that makes these guys standouts is that uh, they ended up being put into the. So essentially, you're talking about Germany in a situation where all manpower is critical. Uh, Literally, they couldn't come up with enough people to do all the stuff they needed to do. Uh, if you put too many people in the field, you didn't have enough people back home to farm and manufacture, and so every person was critical in a certain way. And if you're dealing with a despotic government functioning under Nazism like that, uh, they're going to try to plan to use everybody in whatever ways they can. So overwhelmingly, the people in this reserve police battalion were considered politically unreliable, meaning that the Nazi government did not consider them trustworthy to the Nazi cause. These were people who were deliberately attempting to avoid military service. These were people who weren't joining the right political organizations. Uh, they had particular family ties that made them considered to be unreliable, perhaps relatives who were outspoken in the beginning parts of the Nazi regime, etc. So that's what makes these guys standout group is that these are the Germans who should have been the least susceptible to participating in something so horrific. Uh, so once these guys get deployed and they've spent most of their time in Poland, uh, when uh, the Nazi leadership finally comes to the conclusion that they need to ramp up their ideas of what they need to do with the Jewish problem. And of course, this is uh, going from just merely incarceration and slave labor to an attempt at an extermination. And so initially, what happens is these guys are set in going into the various villages in Poland, figuring out how to identify Jews and other people who were considered non desirables, rounding them up, either trucking or marching them to the railheads and sending them off to the camps to be dispatched there. But what starts happening is the system ends up getting clogged, where uh, the camps are occupied to the level where they can't uh, process the people fast enough, and the railways are actually jammed up with train loads of people stuck along the way because they can't feed them into the camps fast enough. Essentially, what's happened is the gathering process has outstripped the production process. Sorry, the terminology. The more you talk about it, the creepier it gets. So sorry about that. Uh, so what ends up happening is they realize, okay, well, we can't stop the roundups, and we've already got a lot of people we're working on here. So essentially, what happens is the reserve military police units get tasked with executing the undesirables essentially where they find them. And so they get into a process of where they are gathering up the people, marching them out of town to a remote spot, and then shooting them all. And this this is actually one of those areas where it gets um, disturbing is an inadequate word to describe some of the stuff that's going on. Um, and it opens like where the major in charge of the unit gets his orders, and he's telling the troops what the orders are, and he's crying because he considers this to be beneath the dignity of what they should be doing. This isn't something they signed up to do. This isn't what their idea was. And he immediately gave the opportunity for all the older married men to excuse themselves from this duty, so that they had the choice of going or not going. And a lot of them end up going along with the process nonetheless because of the whole unit cohesion thing. They feel you know they feel duty bound to be doing what the rest of the people are doing. If the rest of the people are stuck doing these horrible tasks, they shouldn't have an out. Now, there were handfuls of them, obviously, that just said, yep, we're not doing this. And there were people who were uh, noted for essentially refusing to go along. So they would participate in the roundup part, and they'd march them out to a certain place, and then they'd be put into like security positions in the area around there, making sure no one came wandering up to the killing site. So they didn't have to participate. but the overwhelming majority of them did participate. Uh, this one, okay, I mentioned this because this one psychologically is just kind of gut wrenching. Um, one of the guys in the unit essentially became their expert. Uh, he volunteered and he was the one who shot the children. And he survived, so they got to talk to him about the logic he came to in doing this. And, excuse me, he said he was doing this because since their parents were gone, they wouldn't be able to take care of themselves and they'd end up suffering needlessly. So, in his mind, he was providing them mercy. And of course, the rest of the unit was very happy to allow him to oblige that because that's something they didn't want to do at all. Uh, Even more awkwardly, they did occasionally would run into because people had been deported in out to that area before they'd actually set up some of the camps. They were actually running into Jewish neighbors from their hometown from time to time, and they were essentially in those cases, they said, "I can't. I know this person. We can't do this." But overwhelmingly, what ends up happening is these guys participate, and they participate efficiently, and the numbers they dispatch are pretty huge. Um, Now, some of the things that come out of this that are a little out of the thesis area, and I'll get back to the thesis itself. But out of the thesis area, okay, when you get people who essentially deny the Holocaust happened because they're looking at the various camp numbers and saying, "Well, look, that doesn't add up. Does it? The numbers don't add up." Uh, if you look at the numbers, they're talking about who just got shot out in the field, and they weren't even really doing fantastic record keeping. I'm. It's pretty obvious that these guys working out in the field probably made up for any shortages or missing numbers, bar none. I mean, they were at it uh, a lot. Uh, the second thing that kind of hits you outside the thesis area is the vast amount of manpower put into doing this task. And it just makes you wonder if somehow somehow they weren't doing this naturally contributing to the war effort, what would have changed the outcome of the war. But you have to understand that because Nazism is a form of racial socialism, the racial element had to be there. They could not have their brand of socialism without a racial scapegoat. Um, so yeah, that and there's a lot of parts in the book where you're talking where you get anecdotal stuff about guys and them dealing with it from all ways. The guys who basically couldn't take it anymore to the ones who figured out how to cope with it and do it. It's all a huge, awful degradation of humanity. Obviously, I mean, what they're doing to the people, that they're rounding up and killing is worse, and what they're doing is criminal. But it's this weird idea of how do you deal with this whole believing you have a duty to continue this even though it's abhorrent to your nature. And so the thing that makes this stand out is we're not talking people who were indoctrinated I mean, these weren't people who went through the Hitler Youth and came walking up and had been told this all this life. These are older guys who'd gone through the old school system before the Nazis took over. Uh, they were considered unreliable politically, and yet they carried this out nonetheless. And that's essentially where the title comes from, ordinary men. They weren't these people who were dedicated to the cause. They were just your average ordinary person who was brought caught up in the mess. Now, I think the so essentially the thesis that Browning is trying to get at here is that this could be anyone. Uh, if a similar situation popped up into another country, and we've seen things like this. We've seen Rwanda, Cambodia, essentially all the communist countries at some level. When socialists get to the point where they decide they need to kill a lot of people in order to get things done, somehow they're able to find people who will do it. And they may not be all ridiculously willing. They might be just kind of following the pack or doing things out of a sense of duty. And so I guess that's really where it's the part that kind of really hits home is the idea that do we have people in this country who could end up being Reserve Police Battalion 101? And I think the answer is yes. Uh, he also gets into and there's a reason for this because he got critiqued by an earlier academician who had essentially written another book based off the exact same anecdotes and reports that they got off this unit. And this academician came to the conclusion that this was like a one-shot thing, that this was something that could only happen in Germany, that Germany was a totally unique case, and this has no application anywhere else. And I just find that kind of, I mean, on its surface, it should be kind of obvious that that's a conclusion that's difficult to come to when you see that, although Nazi Germany may be the most famous of all the mass killing nations, others came before and others came after. And so to say that it was a uniquely German experience kind of falls flat. And so Browning, in his afterword, essentially addresses the critique. And he says outright, and it's the same thing I would think, is that I would love for this to be the case, that this was a uniquely German thing, because we don't want to believe that this is part of who we are as human beings. Unfortunately, everything would seem to point otherwise. So if we take just what we have seen historically, that this isn't the only place this has happened. He does bring up several of the well-known psychological experiments. We have the prison guard experiment. We have the electric shock experiment, where essentially the recipient of the shock is an actor, and the person giving the shock is the actual subject of the test. And the overwhelming bulk of them continued turning up the electric levels, the fake electrical levels, even when it said it was past a danger point, because somebody in authority told them to do it. And these are Americans. So if you can just randomly grab people and bring them into an experiment and get them to torture and potentially endanger people's lives for just an experiment, that says a lot. Now, I mean, it says a lot to backing up his thesis. So the idea that if you took, let's say, somehow something like this popped up here, socialism in America, and the socialists decide that they have groups that are going to round up and do horrible things too. why wouldn't the same Americans who would sit down and turn an electric knob when there's no force being suggested here. They're a volunteer. They have someone in a white lab coat and a clipboard saying, "Yeah, go ahead, it's safe. Turn it up, turn it up, turn it up." Even when they're starting to wonder what they're doing, if you take a similar group of people and basically put them in a situation saying, "Okay, you got to kill all those people over there, and if you don't, not only are you going to end up dead, but so is your family." They're probably going to do it. So, yeah, I think that gives a good summary of it. I mean, this book's a drag. I mean, but it's readable. I mean, the writing style is fairly easy to follow. He doesn't bog you down with how. I mean, he takes information from a foreign language file and puts it into a very readable format. It's very. I mean, at points, it almost reads like a novel, even though he's just basically retelling anecdotes. Uh, but I mean, there are points in here that are truly disturbing. Uh, it's not a good bedtime story. I mean, it's one of those ones that you read it and you may be up past your bedtime for a little while it kind of runs through your head and works its way through. But I do recommend it if you are to understand what happens in totalitarian countries and understand that this can happen to anyone. I think it helps you immunize you against becoming one of these people. So, that said, I do appreciate you taking time to listen to this tonight. If you like the content, please hit the like button or smash the like button, as a lot of the other YouTubers say. If you think somebody would find this content interesting, please share it with them. If you like this, I do put this stuff out like this a couple of times a week. Uh, and if you like this, subscribe to my channel. If you have comments on this, please do comment. I frequently answer your comments, and if a comment is uh, beefy enough that I might actually make an entire video off your comment in order to fill out the information that'd be too hard to fill out in a comment section. All right. Well, thank you very much. Hope to see you again in a future video.